Now, by far, one of the most common and repeated comments I get on these videos is, what settings do you use? Even when I put all of the settings on the images within the video. I don't know. See, there are a lot of variables to take into account when it comes to getting the perfect exposure. See, even something like lens choice can completely throw things out. My 50mm f1.8 on my system might not transmit the same amount of light to the sensor as the 50mm f1.8 on your system. T-stops for the win. On a sunny day with broken cloud, just simply changing direction or the cloud going over the sun can result in a massive swing in exposure. So in the space of 30 seconds, you could shift by like 3 stops quite easily. Now let's consider a night scene. Say my scene has a car coming into it just out of frame, but it's got its headlights on full beam and it's lighting up my scene nicely. That's going to give me a much different exposure to what you would get without said car. So as a result of this, even when I put on the images all of the EXIF data to let you know what settings I used and what my exposure was, I get comments like this. Well, what the hell do I do with that? I'll tell you. I make a video all about how to nail exposure every single time, no matter what camera you're using, what conditions you're in, any of that. I'll do it now, right now. You're watching it. Welcome, enjoy. So to get started, we need to turn on our audio. Oh, we already did. To get started, we need to look at the exposure triangle, and this represents the balance between ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, and it looks like this. Now, this isn't very difficult to understand. All you need is a basic understanding of maths and the correlation between the numbers at each point of the triangle. Now, the elements at each point of the exposure triangle all have a dual function. While they all increase light in terms of their exposure, they also affect things like how much is in focus, how much noise you're going to get, and how much movement you're going to see in your images. So let's start with shutter speed, because this controls the movement within your images. Faster shutter speeds serve to freeze movement, slower shutter speeds allow more movement in your images, so like light trails, silky water, that kind of thing. Let's get started with some numbers. Now, these numbers are all approximate, so don't start coming at me in the comments like, oh, you said. To freeze a person walking, you would need anywhere between 1/100th of a second and probably 1/250th of a second, depending on the person, you know, size and stride and all of those other things. Now, if that person was running, or you're talking about a bicycle, you're probably going to want something like 1/500th of a second, or perhaps even 1/1000th of a second, depending again on how fast they are moving. Now, if you want to freeze a bird in flight, anywhere from 1/2500th of a second upwards, because those little birds, they don't half move. So as a general rule of thumb, you want to freeze motion, get that shutter speed as fast as you possibly can, and compensate with both aperture and ISO to fix the exposure. Now, let's go the other way. So you don't want to freeze motion. You want to get that blur. You want to get the silky water or the light trails or anything like that, something like this or like this. You're going to want a slower shutter speed. Now, these were both shot at 1/8 of a second. Generally, if I shoot waterfalls and things like that, I usually slow it down to about 1/6 of a second because I like to see some texture still in the water. But if you want to go all out and get that misty kind of look on the waterfalls or whatever, or if you're going to be doing light trails at night, knock yourself out, 20 seconds onwards, whatever. All right, so let's talk about aperture. Now, aperture controls how much of your image is actually in focus. So something like f1.4, which is oftentimes preferred for portraits or more artsy things, is going to let in a ton of light, but the focal plane is going to be very, very thin. Conversely, for landscapes, when you're talking about numbers from f9, say up to like f16 or whatever, a lot of that's going to be in focus. In fact, pretty much everything from 20 feet to infinity is going to be in relative focus. Now, a fast lens with a wide aperture is a fantastic thing to have if you're shooting at night. That way you can keep your shutter speed just a little bit higher in order to freeze motion, but keep your ISO down in order to keep that noise under control. Too long didn't read version. When choosing your aperture, just simply decide how much of your image you want in focus. If you want that shallow depth of field, obviously, wide aperture, low f number. If you want a lot in focus, like for a landscape shot, high aperture, higher number, like between f9, f16, that kind of thing. Moving on, ISO is by far the simplest of them all. It's basically a volume knob for your camera, but for many people, it's like the boogeyman of photography. Digital noise as a result of increasing your ISO varies massively from brand to brand, sensor format, all that kind of thing. And it's not just as simple as bigger sensors are better in low light, because that's not strictly true. A lot of older cameras, even with bigger sensors, are bloody appalling in low light compared to a modern APS-C or even a Micro Four Thirds. So while some cameras produce noise which is more like a fine grain and produce beautiful images right up to 3200 ISO and beyond, other cameras at like say 800 ISO will start to fall apart really badly, producing nasty, horrible color artifacts in the dark areas and all that kind of thing. So despite what the full frame fanboys will have you believe, sensor size isn't the be all and end all when it comes to decent looking noise or low noise. They're kind of weird, aren't they? Kind of like flat earthers. You present them with evidence. It's flat. More evidence and science. It's flat. I have data and proof. Look, proof. It's flat. So an easy way to deal with ISO in any camera, your camera included, is to think about what's too much for you. So take a bunch of photos that ever increase in ISOs up to a point where you start to think, you know what? That's starting to look a bit rough now. Call that your upper limit for ISO. Simple. All right, so let's talk about the sunny 16 rule. Now, if you're not aware of what the sunny 16 rule is, it basically states that on a bright sunny day, if you use f16, your shutter speed and your ISO will have the same number. So ISO 100, shutter speed 1/100. ISO 400, shutter speed 1/400. And of course, this can be used for film as well as digital. Now, this isn't going to get you a perfect exposure every single time, but it's going to get you pretty bloody close. And from what we've already learned from the exposure triangle, you can tweak that depending on how you want your image to look in order to make a perfect exposure. So say, like now, the cloud has rolled in, and it's probably giving me 2 stops of difference. So I would simply choose to go f8 instead of f16, which is 2 stops of difference, and I would gain that light back. Alternatively, for 2 stops on the ISO, I could go from ISO 100 to ISO 400, and with a shutter speed, you would go from 1/100th of a second down to 1/25th of a second. Again, exactly the same exposure. Now, learning the exposure triangle to me is probably one of the most important technical things you can learn about photography. When used with the histogram and the light meter and your metering modes and your personal knowledge of your camera, it's going to allow you to absolutely nail exposure every single time. All right, so to end this video, if this is all getting a bit too much, if it's too much technical jargon for you and you're just not getting your head around it, simply try the auto modes in your camera. Either full auto or shutter priority or aperture priority. There's absolutely no shame in using those things. If you get the shot, that's all that matters. It doesn't matter how you got there. And if you do use these modes, take note of the EXIF data. That EXIF data will tell you exactly what your camera thought was needed in order to get that shot. And then you can take those numbers and then you could use what you've learned about aperture and shutter speed and ISO and tweak those numbers in order to maintain the same exposure but get the effects that you want. All right, I've been yapping long enough. See you in the next one.